Hey guys, what's going on? It's Ben here, and I'm back today with a cool video idea that I've had for actually a pretty long time, about over a year, but I'm just now getting around to doing it. It is going to be a 4-part series covering who I think are the best teams from each decade in the NBA, from the 80s to the current decade, the 2010s. So I'm going to cover in this first video the 80s, and then the next video the 90s, the 2000s, and then the current decade, the 2010s, each in their own separate video. I will go through each conference and talk about the best teams in each conference. Not every single team, because some are irrelevant basically for the decade that I'm talking about, but the top half who are more consistently in the playoffs, I'll be discussing each one a little bit. So for each team in each decade, I will break down their average win total over the years, and also I have assigned a grading system for their playoff berths. So like, here's how it goes. If you missed the playoffs, I assign you 0 points. If you got to the first round, I give 1 point. Semifinals 2, conference finals 3, a finals appearance gets 4 points, and winning a championship gets 5. So I totaled all those up for each decade, and I came up with a composite score, and then that, along with the win totals, will sort of give an idea of which was the best team for each conference in the specific decade I'm talking about. And also, just for reference, like if I'm doing the 1980s, the first season would be the 79 to 80 season, because it's more like when the playoffs happen. So those would be the 1980 playoffs. In the last year of that decade, I'm going to count as the 1988 to 1989 season, because that was the last year where the playoffs were in the 1980s. So if you're confused and you're like, why aren't the 1989 to 90 Pistons on the list? The reason is because that I'm going to count as technically in the 90s, because most of the season happened in 1990. Alright, so to start off with, I'm going to cover the Western Conference first for the 1980s. So the best team in this decade in the Western Conference was definitely the Los Angeles Lakers. Their average win total per season was 59 wins, which is really good, just a shade below 60. They were basically the best team in their conference just about every year. They made the finals, let's see here, in 80, 82, 83, 84, 85, 87, 88, and 89. So the only 2 years that they didn't make the finals were 86 and 81, and both times the Houston Rockets made it, but we'll get to them later. So they had a really good score as far as playoff appearances. They won 5 championships during this time. So let me see here to make sure. 1, 2, 80, 82, 85, 87, and 88. So yeah, 5 titles. So yeah, they were by far the best team in the West during this era. So moving on to the next team I have is the Rockets, because they had the 2 finals appearances. They actually were not that good, but besides those 2 years though. They missed the playoffs a few times, and most of the other years in the 80s they were out in the first round. But they did make the 2 finals, one with Moses Malone and the other with Ralph Sampson and Hakeem, so that was impressive. So their composite score was 16 for the playoffs versus the Lakers, which was 41, which is insanely high. Their average win total in a season was actually pretty low too. During the 80s, they averaged 40 wins per year, which is pretty low. And actually, a lot of the years that they made the playoffs and lost in the first round, they were actually like a 40-win team. And something pretty interesting is the year in 1981 when they got to the finals with Moses, they actually were only a 40-win team. That just, I think, speaks to how back then the NBA just was totally different in that I don't think ever in today's game a 40-win team would be making the finals, but there you go. The next team I have is the Phoenix Suns. they were a pretty average team throughout this era. No finals appearances. They made the conference finals twice, which is pretty good. But they were usually out in the second or first round, and they missed the playoffs a few times. Their composite score was 14, which is decent, and they had 44 wins on average. The next team I have is the Seattle Supersonics with a composite score of 13 from their playoff appearances and an average win total of 42 a year, which is pretty good. I mean, I don't know. They made the conference finals twice in 1980 and 87, but besides that, nothing much of note. Moving on, the Portland Trailblazers had a composite score of 11. They were mainly losing in the first round in the 80s with Clyde in his earlier years. They lost in the first round in 1980, 81, let's see here, 84, 86, 87, 88, 89. So that is a total of 7 first-round losses in a possible 10 years, which is actually sort of impressive that they had that much consistency. They had a composite playoff score of 11 and an average win total of 44 wins per year. Moving on, we got the Nuggets during the Alex English, Kiki Vandeweghe era. The Nuggets had a playoff composite score of 13. They reached the conference finals in 1985, right at the apex of Alex English's career. And they had an average win total per season of 43 wins, which is pretty decent. And the last team I have on here is the Spurs. They're a pretty decent team throughout various points in the 80s. They reached back-to-back conference finals in 82 and 83, sort of during the tail end of the George Gervin years in San Antonio. And then they missed the playoffs in 84 and 85, 86, 87. They lost in the first round every year. They had a composite playoff score of 12, which is pretty decent. And they had 40 average wins per year, which is okay. It's really not that good, but they're still making the playoffs with sub-500 records, which is really interesting, I think. So I think when you look at this overall Western Conference of the 80s, it definitely is just dominated by the Lakers totally, with almost next to no competition, really, considering the Lakers made the finals all but 2 years, and those 2 years were by the Rockets, who actually, besides those 2 finals appearances, didn't really do that well in the 80s. So, yeah, it was just total Laker domination. Besides that, the other teams that they faced in the conference finals, it was always a carousel, it seemed like, between Suns, Sonics, Nuggets, Spurs. So they're all pretty much on the same playing field, and the Blazers are in there too as sort of the team that perpetually goes out in the first round. So the 1980s in the West was totally, completely owned by the Lakers. So moving on, I'm going to do the East in the 80s now. So the East is a similar deal in the 80s, primarily dominated by one team, but a little bit more spread out because the Boston Celtics' reign of terror started to slow down a lot more towards the end of the 80s and actually completely died out in the 90s, but that's for the next video. So looking at Boston first, they, like the Lakers, had an average win total per season of 59 wins, and they reached a lot of finals. Let's see here. They won the title in 81, they won the title in 84 and 86, and they got to the finals in 85 and 87. So that's a total trip of 5 trips to the finals, which is pretty good. And the reason that they didn't get there more was because the 76ers were pretty good during a stretch in the 80s with Moses Malone and Julius Erving and the beginning of Charles Barkley coming on. But the Celtics really dominated, and they made the playoffs every year in this decade, which is impressive. They made the conference finals 3 times when they didn't reach the finals. Those were usually losing to the Pistons or 76ers in the early 80s. And so, yeah, they were definitely the best team in this time. Their composite score for playoff appearances was 35, which is really good. and by far the highest of anyone on here. And so moving on, the next team I have is the Detroit Pistons. I have a rule that if a team wins a championship in a decade, they deserve to be on the list. So that's a big reason why Detroit is on here, along with them doing well in some other years. But they were really bad for the first half of the 80s. Their first playoff appearance coming in 1984. They made the second round in 85, and then first round 86. They really started to get better in 87. They made the conference finals, and then the year after the finals, and then finally in 89 they win the championship. But they really worked their way up throughout the 80s. Their composite playoff score is 16, which is probably lower than you thought because they missed the playoffs for about the first half of the decade. And their average win total during this decade was 43 wins, which is okay, but not nearly as good as the Celtics. But they did win a championship in this decade, so you got to give that to them. Moving on, my next team is the Milwaukee Bucks, who also have the distinction with the Celtics as being the only team to make the playoffs every decade or every year of this decade. Usually a second round exit, it looks like on here I have 80, 81, 82, 84, and 87, and 89. They lost in the second round, so that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 of the years. Yeah, 6 of the years. And 3 of the years they got to the conference finals in 83, 84, and 85. And then 88 they lost in the first round. So a good amount of playoff success. Their composite playoff score is 22, which is pretty good. It's the third best among these Eastern teams during the 1980s. And they had an average win total of 52, which is also third best. The next team I have is the Atlanta Hawks. They were a pretty average team during this period. You got the Dominique era that came along, and he was there basically all of the 80s, and they were always sort of a stepping stone, much like the Trailblazers, who I talked about for the Western Conference. The Hawks lost in the first or second round every year. They never made the conference finals during the 80s. They had a composite playoff score of 12 and an average of 45 wins per season, but they only missed the playoffs in 2 of these years, so that's pretty good. The next team I have on here is the Philadelphia 76ers. Philly was really good during the early half of the 80s and tapered off a bit during the second half. They made the finals in 3 of the first 4 years of the 80s and the conference finals in the 1 year that they missed it. They won a title in 83, which was impressive, with Dr. J and Moses Malone. Made another conference finals in 85, and then sort of tapered off, became a second round or first round team. They have a composite playoff score of 24, which is second best to the Celtics, and an average win total of 54 wins, which is second best also to the Celtics. The Bulls are an interesting one on here. I think you're going to be surprised by a few of them. A few of their numbers. So they made the playoffs consistently in the second half of the 80s when Michael Jordan came along and missed it for most of the first half. Between 80 to 84, they only made it once when they got to the second round in 1981. And then when Michael got there, let's see here. When Michael got there, they lost in the first round 3 straight years. Then got to the second round in 88 and the conference finals in 89. But the interesting thing, so their composite playoff score is 10, which is pretty low. And the interesting thing is that on a lot of those first round teams, they actually had below 500 records. So in 85, the first year of Michael Jordan, when they made the first round, they had 38 wins and made the playoffs. The next year, they had 30 wins. They were 30 and 52, and they made the playoffs as the 8th seed. And then the next year, they had 40 wins, and they made the playoffs as the 8th seed again and lost in the first round. So their average win total is actually very low. It's 37. But they did come on strong at the end of the 80s, making a conference finals in the second round. And they did have consistent playoff appearances in that they made the playoffs every year in the last 5 years of the 80s. So there you go. So just looking overall at the Eastern Conference, pretty much dominated by the Celtics for the most part, but a little bit more contested than in the West. You also had Philadelphia coming out of the East a few years, and the Bucks were always in it, never made the finals, but were in the conference finals or second round a lot. And so it was, I'm still going to say it was the Celtics conference by a wide margin during the 80s, but for the first half, Philadelphia gave them a run for their money, and throughout the whole thing, the Bucks were always there, and always competing, but never actually getting to the finals. Sort of like how you might think of today's Raptors, I feel like. Just always like a second round team, or maybe conference finals in a weaker year. So there you have it, guys. That's the overall look at the 1980s. Primarily dominated by the Celtics and Lakers, with decent performances from the 76ers as maybe the second best team in the East. And in the West, I would maybe argue that the Suns were the second best team. Yeah, or the Blazers, just not because of them being part of the playoffs, but just their regular season consistency. And the reason I want to do this is because I found a lot of interesting numbers on a lot of these teams, and I've just heard a lot of sportscasters say that, if a team doesn't win a championship, it's a bust, like the phrase championship or bust, but I don't think that's always the case. And a lot in the upcoming videos, I think you're going to find out a lot of interesting things. And there are a lot of teams where they didn't necessarily they didn't win the championship, but they were still the best team of their decade even. So I think that that'd be something interesting for you guys to find out about. So I'd say that the next video is one of my favorites, to talk about the West in the 1990s. So stay tuned in the next couple days for that video, and I hope you enjoyed this one. Alright, bye guys, see you next time.